Good evening and welcome to the launch of this year's Armed Conflict Survey from the International Institute of Strategic Studies. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the director of the IISS Asia office, and I'm speaking to you here this evening from Singapore. However, we're joined by an array of IISS experts to mark the launch of our Armed Conflict Survey, both in London, in the United States, and here in Asia as well. The Armed Conflict Survey, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is one of the landmark publications of the IISS each year. You can see on the slides a picture of the front cover and some of the digital products there. It's developed by our conflict, security and development team, led by Irene, who you'll hear from in just a minute. And conflict is at the heart of what the IISS is about. We're an institute that defines itself as studying the role of war, power, and rules in international systems. And so conflict and where conflict occurs and why it occurs is a big part of what we're doing. You can see here the list of 8 separate speakers who we're going to bring to you this evening. Our aim is to give a taste for our audience of a 400-page document in only 1 hour. So we've got our work cut out, but we're going to give it a good go. The event this evening is going to be in 3 segments. First, we're going to hear from Irene, the maestro behind the report, and 2 of the team who have worked on it, Benjamin Petrini and Samir from my own office here in Singapore, Dr. Samir Puri. They're going to give you the context of the report and give you a flavor of the analysis. Then we're going to jump to what I'll call the regional takeaways segment, where we'll turn in rapid fire succession to authors who have contributed to particular regional focuses of the report. So what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in Asia, with a few country-specific segments as well on the conflict in Afghanistan and Myanmar, given they're 2 of the most high profile. And then we'll have time, I hope, to squeeze in a few questions from the audience at the end, which you can ask using the Q&A function, or if you also want to drop them into the chat, I can pick them up there. So that's our running order. We're going to run only for 1 hour, so it's going to be a brisk pacing. And with that, I will hand over to Dr. Irene. Congratulations on an impressive piece of work, the 6th time that we have published this report, but the best yet, I think. Can you give our audience an overview of some of the themes that we see in this year's report? Irene, over to you.
Thanks, James. And also, just wanted to add my welcome and my thanks for joining us in this launch of the report. It's a very exciting day for us. It's been lots of months of work. It's a very big day. It's also a very big report, as James said. So I'll just kick off the conversation presenting the main highlights of the report that my colleagues will delve into. So just to present the publication to you, this is a publication, is one of the annual flagship publication of the IISS. It has been launched for the first time in 2015, so this is our 6th editions. We are global. We are covering 34 conflicts this year across 5 regions: Americas, Europe, Eurasia, Middle East, and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. We are covering all typology of conflicts, so we are covering interstate, even if there are very few, internal conflict, be they insurgencies, intercommunal violence, or simple organized crime, and also internationalized internal conflict. We are trying to be very strategic in the way in which we are looking at conflict. So what we want to do with our report is really provide unique insight into the drivers of conflict, but also geopolitical and geoeconomic linkages across conflict regions and globally. This year, we're also introducing regional essays, which actually try to really look at those threats across the world. And also, we are, as every year, covering some global trends, which we have selected based on their global relevance for the current and future conflict landscape. This year, we are also introducing a new composite indicators, which is called the Armed Conflict Global Relevance Indicators, a bit of a long name, but that's what it is. And the idea of this indicator is all trying to assess the global relevance of conflict as a tool of prioritizing our analysis in the book. As usual, the report is full of data, is very rich in data, is rich in maps and infographics and key statistics, as you will see also in this hour, because we're going to share some of them with you. The last thing I wanted to point out about the report is that it is forward-looking. More than ever, we are trying really to look at the specific and regional outlook for conflict. We are trying to identify future hotspots for conflict, but also areas of fragility and political risk to watch that should be really top of mind for everybody working or sadly involved into conflict. So in terms of main highlights of the conflict, of the report, sorry, I'm just going to very quickly do an overview of some of the strengths. The first thing we have noticed, which is quite counterintuitive, is that despite the coronavirus pandemic related mobility disruption, and also the fact that the UN, you will remember, called for a global ceasefire, the number of conflicts this year actually reached a record high in 2020. So also the global conflict landscape remained dominated by internal conflicts. We just cover a handful of interstate conflict. But really, third-party intervention has continued to increase last year. Indeed, third-party intervention has tripled in the last 10 years. So what we're seeing is really an increasingly complex conflict landscape. We've seen an increasing number of internal and external actors involved. We see a growing number of powers, apart from the usual suspect intervening in conflict and peacemaking as well, in pursuit of their foreign policy agendas. Also, we see non-state armed groups becoming much more complex. They are proliferating in numbers, in natures, and also in motives. And also, they keep and have still lots of transnational linkages and regional spillovers. The other thing we are seeing about conflicts is that conflicts are becoming longer and more intractable. And this we see amid blurring boundaries between war and post-war, between war and peace, and frequent conflict relapses. We are estimating the duration of conflict in 2020 at 30 years, so it's quite very long conflict. In terms of region, Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA remain the most conflict-prone regions in the world. Why conflict escalated across Sub-Saharan Africa? We have actually followed in real time escalation in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad basin, in Ethiopia and also Mozambique, which are covering for the first time this year. MENA continue to remain the home of some of the most intractable conflict with external intervention: Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Iraq, of course. My last highlight would be really on the connection between the pandemic and conflicts, or pandemic and conflict. And just to say that, as we have said, the pandemic didn't really disrupt conflict as much as other activities in the world, but its disastrous socioeconomic tolls will likely work as an incubator for future instability and conflict, if not addressed. And that's, of course, amid lost development gains and rising poverty, rising inequality, and rising food insecurity, especially in the global south of the world. At the same time, against the backdrop of falling aid resources and also, obviously, much reduced fiscal space for government in conflict-affected and also fragile countries. We are also seeing that climate change as a very similar it is already and will increasingly play a similar role than the pandemic as a multiplier of root causes of conflict and political instability. We have seen it a bit this year, specifically in Central America after the tropical storm that took place there. So just a couple of words on the indicator we are introducing this year. So the indicator is actually our contribution, I would say, to the study of conflict, and it's really something that we felt it was useful, taking into account what I have discussed of this very complex conflict landscape, which features also internal, international factors. We really wanted to have a go and try to assess in a numerical way the global relevance of conflict. For us, global relevance is very important because as IISS, we are global, and also we are we are really focused on geopolitical and global issues and research topics. So what we are trying to do with these indicators is a very simple indicators. We look at 3 different pillars of global significance. One has to do with the human impact, and the human impact in terms of really the impact that forced displacement and other human misery as in terms of domestic and regional instability, with spillover effect that can threaten regional and global security and stability. So that's our angle for human impact. Incidence of conflict is a measure of intensity and the related security implication and spillover in neighboring countries and also beyond that. And of course, the geopolitical impact is very important. And here we're trying to measure the involvement of third parties in an intervention by international community in conflict. All those indicators are proxies of what we try to measure. They're not by all means precise. They're not by all means perfect, but we do hope that it's going to help give our contribution, and also really looking at the filter of conflict, the filter of global significance when we look at conflict. What we are doing with these indicators, it's really using it to visualize the results of indicator through the book. So just to give you an example, this is actually the findings in themselves, and it's really, as you see, we are using a color progression, which actually really tries to capture the different variation across countries and conflicts. And we're trying to visualize it you'll see it visualized in the book, in the conflict chapter, in the regional chapter, in the maps, but also in the charts of global conflict, which is you have. This is the chart of armed conflict, which is a map, a chart that we always produce with the book. And in this case, you see that the shading is actually the geopolitical indicator shading. So we hope that is going to be helpful also to visualize in a more comprehensive way conflict global significance. And with that, I think I will pass the floor to Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you very much, James, for chairing this event. I want to briefly talk about one rising trend, which one entire essay in the Armed Conflict Survey is dedicated to. And this concerns the long aftermath of war, as we call it. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean that increasingly today, the post-conflict phase lingers on for a long time as a direct consequence of the increasing complexity and protractedness of conflict. And this trend has profound implications for post-conflict interventions and for policies of reconstruction. Now, today we witness a conflict glut. There is a failure to end all conflicts that are in a permanent state of crisis, like the DRC, Somalia, Pakistan, and among others. And there is also a stall on the progress to address new conflicts that have started after 2010, like Syria, Yemen, and Libya. In the Armed Conflict Survey 2021, we show how today conflict lasts longer, they increasingly recur, and they move between war and peace and between phases of violence and non-violence in a non-linear fashion. Therefore, active conflict and post-conflict situations increasingly overlap because post-conflict interventions increasingly start while a country is at war. In the early 1990s, after the Cold War, when the modern post-conflict reconstruction was conceived, the cooperation among great powers was instrumental to the resolution and successful post-conflict reconstruction of a number of conflicts. For example, El Salvador, Cambodia, and Namibia, that are prominent examples. Now, some of those conditions no longer exist today. Plus, over time, post-conflict intervention expanded its scope and its reach, with the result that we call post-war some situations where violence have not subsided at all, where in short there are not those enabling conditions for implementing peace building. So to conclude, from a policy perspective, post-conflict intervention today has three weaknesses or three issues to be solved. The first one, it is implemented while political settlement is either weak or unstable. Two, post-conflict intervention in many cases further accentuates the center-periphery divide when violence is ongoing, because post-conflict policies are often concentrated in the capital city and in main urban centers where violence is lower. And three, post-conflict intervention over-relies on a technocratic approach to transform societies and rebuild economies, which may often be unrealistic. So a new approach or a new reflection to begin with is warranted, and that what we are trying to do with the Aftermath of War research project here at IISS. I'll pass it on to Samir for some of his findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. And I'm going to be talking about another of the global trends that we identify in this year's Armed Conflict Survey, and that relates to the changing nature of military interventions by powerful countries in active armed conflicts. And I think this is a particularly striking and, dare I say, poignant theme to pick up in light of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the images and the realities of which are very much fresh in all of our minds. Certainly with the Biden administration moving to withdraw US forces from Afghanistan, there's a very clear desire to bookend the 9/11 cycle of US military interventions. But what we've done with this publication is to do a comparison, as you can see in front of you, between the nature of interventions by militarily powerful countries. And by that, we're simply cutting that by the G20 plus a couple of others, Iran and Israel. You can see that it was quite a Western-dominated phenomenon back in 2011. Particularly in relation to interventions that were in pursuit of terrorist groups associated with Al-Qaeda. Today, and certainly in the last 4 to 5 years, the widening of the cast of characters and cast of state actors involved in military interventions is really dramatic. And you can see that Turkey and Russia are in particular extrovert powers when it comes to mounting military interventions. And these military interventions vary considerably in their nature, all the way from interventions such as those pursued by Russia in neighboring Ukraine under the radar, using proxies, superficially deniable, all the way to the way in which Saudi Arabia has had assembled a coalition, secured legitimacy to intervene in Yemen. This trend is not necessarily distinguishing between the types of interventions or indeed the motivations or strategic goals, but very simply is pointing to a fact that alongside the geopolitical trends of change that we are all accustomed to in relation to perhaps not the arrival of multipolarity, but certainly a departure from some assumptions of unipolarity that the international system was operating under since the Cold War. Armed conflicts are beginning to see some of these implications bear down upon them, because countries that perhaps as recently as 10 years ago may not have been able to internationally or in capability terms mount into independent military interventions are now doing so. Just a couple of reflections on the implications of this and a little bit on the outlook in less than a minute. Some of the implications relate to the fact that we don't know whether there'll be a further widening of powerful countries intervening in conflicts to shape them for their own national agendas. But some of the consequences also relate to the implications for conflict resolution, which we go to in this essay. And in relation to the outlook, we reflect on the aforementioned issue of whether there will be further intervening powers. And finally, whether the nature of intervention, for instance, Russia relying on the Wagner Group, mercenaries, and perhaps the arrival of uninhabited aerial or ground vehicles might reduce some of the entry costs to military interveners of the future. So with that, I will hand over back to the chair.
Thank you very much to my colleagues, Samir Puri, Benjamin Petrini, and Irene, some of whom you're going to hear from in a minute. Now let's move to the second segment of this evening's launch event, which is what we're going to call our takeaways segment. So I'm going to now moderate a brisk tour of the world's conflict areas, beginning with my colleague in our headquarters in London, Emile Hokayem, normally based in our office in the Middle East. Emile happens to be with us in London. So drawing, Emile, perhaps on Samir's point about the growing internationalization of conflict, could you give us your couple of takeaways from the conflict sector looking at the Middle East and North Africa in this year's Armed Conflict Survey?
James, good afternoon to all. The trend that Samir identified can be very well illustrated in the Middle East. Regionalization and internationalization of Middle Eastern countries is an enduring feature of the landscape. It's not an accident. And the map that is shown right now illustrates just one dimension of that internationalization of conflict. It's the support by states, whether it's material or political or else, to local non-state actors. As you can see, it's a bit dizzying, but it reflects a little bit the geopolitics of the region, and it also helps understand the very complex nature of the fighting, the political brinksmanship that happens in each of these conflicts. So those foreign powers that we have identified intervene in a variety of ways. The two most important ones to note these days are, as the map showed, support for non-state actors. The second one is greater deployment of technology on the ground, especially air power, UAVs, and air defense. There's also a trend to deploy troops. Turkey did it in Libya, for instance, in 2020. Russia does it in Syria. The UAE used to have a large contingent in Yemen. It has withdrawn it. But the direct dimension is perhaps not as pronounced or as sustained as the other elements that I mentioned, deployment of technology and support for non-state actors. The second takeaway from the Middle East chapter is that the main conflicts in the region have taken different paths. There was a time where it felt that Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq were all on fire at the same time, and it all was very fuzzy, and there was a sense that everyone was fighting everyone. It has changed in the past year and a half. In Libya, you had a major escalation in 2019, 2020. Then a military stalemate, in large part because of foreign intervention, in this case Turkey. And that stalemate led to de-escalation and a political process that has been encouraged and accompanied by a level of international attention that didn't exist before. Syria is a different case. It's a quasi-frozen conflict. You had a major escalation in 2020, followed by a relatively calm year, calm by Syrian standards. But you had actually a pickup in fighting just recently with major operations conducted in southern Syria up until a few days. And in this case, there's no real UN process. There is no real attempt at conflict management through a multilateral process. It's much more the parties essentially establishing zones of influence and agreeing on the rules in those spaces. Yemen is yet another example where you had ongoing fighting because it's a multi-party conflict. The main external player there, Saudi Arabia, is keen to extricate itself, but precisely because of that and because of the US is pressuring it, I think the opposing party, the Houthi insurgency, is pushing in a different direction. It thinks it won. So actually it has an interest in escalating. And this is what's happening recently. The final point I make is that we are seeing the emergence of new hotspots in the region. None of them qualify as full-fledged conflict, but whether it's the Eastern Mediterranean, the Western Sahara post the Abraham Accord, Sahel instability because of France rethinking its involvement there, or the Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia competition over the Nile River. All these contain the ingredients for further instability. Thank you.
Very good. Let me turn back now to Benjamin Petrini in Washington. Benjamin, could you give us a couple of takeaways from the work that you did on sub-Saharan Africa?
Thank you, James. Yes, absolutely. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most conflict-affected region globally, together with the Middle East and North Africa, as Irene mentioned at the very beginning. It therefore has a prominent position in this year's Armed Conflict Survey, as it features 11 armed conflicts in this region, which are nearly a third of the total. 2020, as for global trends, also in Africa set a record high in the number of armed conflicts, both state-based internal conflicts and armed conflicts between non-state armed groups without state involvement. We expect 2021 to confirm these upward trends. In a telegraphic way, let me tell you there are three main points that I would like you to take home on Sub-Saharan Africa. The first one, there is a boom in third-party interventions by an array of diverse states, as Samir analyzed at the global level. This is very, very prominent in Sub-Saharan Africa. Russia has military involvement and political interest in the Central African Republic. France, which is present in the Sahel, and the US in Somalia. But we also see regional countries that are getting involved, like Rwanda, being militarily present in the Central African Republic, and Eritrea intervening in Ethiopia. So there is an increasing, in the region, there is an increasing geopolitical dimension that on the surface could resemble proxy wars, as armed conflict is increasingly used in the region as a tool of geopolitical competition. Trend number two, and maybe you can put up the slide again of the map. Conflicts in the region have a regional character and are increasingly becoming regional wars. We see the conflict in the Sahel, on the border regions between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The one in the Lake Chad Basin, at the border between Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon. But also the war in the protracted conflicts in the Eastern DRC, which have been going for more than 4 decades now, and the relationship between the multiple crises in the Horn of Africa, centered around the current civil war in Ethiopia. So the second point is this regional character of war. And the third point is that as COVID forced the countries to reallocate resources to the health sector and to address the fallout of the pandemic, non-state armed groups have become more powerful and gained territory in the Sahel, in Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in the CAR. In some of these theaters, the mix between local grievances and the transnational ideology of radical Islam is actually proving very successful. So these three factors make conflicts in Sub-Saharan Africa more complex, intractable, and potentially protracted. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Okay, so from Sub-Saharan Africa, we're now going to turn to the Americas, particularly South and Central America. And for that, I'm going to hand back to Dr. Irene, who, as well as doing our conflict and development team, is also one of our Latin American specialists at the Institute. So Irene, back to you.
Thanks, James. Yeah, Latin America is a bit of a different type of conflict typology. So what we see, it's really a mix of organized crime and political violence. We see a variety of criminal armed groups fighting with one another and with the government for mostly control of illicit economies. What we've seen also happening in recent time, in particular last year with the pandemic, has been really those non-state armed groups acquiring more and more a quasi-state role in their area of governance. So basically, what we have seen is those groups very much stepping in to replace the state in really the provision of services. We have seen during the pandemic enforcing lockdown, fixing the price, fixing pricing, and really ensuring governance in their area of controls, where the role of the state obviously is not stretching. What does this brought about is really an increased legitimacy of those groups with the local population, and also really they have become some actor, some almost political actor, I would say, that government will need to reckon with going forward. In general, the pandemic has been very good for criminal groups. I mean, as we know, Latin America has been probably the worst hit region by the pandemic. But criminal groups have actually found a very good business opportunity in the pandemic. Not just they have been much quicker than other businesses in reconfiguring their supply chains, but also they really have embraced digitalization for their activities. So in a way, I think what we see now and what we're going to see more and more going forward is really a much more complex landscape, whereby we will have legal and criminal governance structure coexisting and overlapping in parts of the regions. And this really may prompt some government really to explore less traditional approaches to non-state armed groups in the region, also because they are now from a position of more weakness, I would say, also following the pandemic. So negotiating with criminal groups, not only to curb violence as has been done in the past, but also to address specific issues, for instance, service provision or the vaccine rollout, as it happened, as we've seen happening in Brazil, may be increasingly an option for government. Of course, this will come with risk of legitimacy to start with, but also it's quite unclear whether they would actually lead to permanent improvement, if any. More general, regional drivers of conflict will remain policies and development in Colombia, Venezuela, and especially the US, especially the latter policies on drugs, access to firearms, and migration, on which we don't expect much changes, unfortunately. Climate change also, it's something that I think I need to highlight. It will continue to generate instability, especially in the northern triangle of Central America, across the dry corridor, which is an area which is particularly affected by climate change, and we continue to multiply through causes of conflict in the region and migration. We also anticipate more instability along the US border with Mexico and the border region between Venezuela and Colombia. And I would finish my remarks with saying that if we talk about hotspot of political risk and future conflicts to watch, Venezuela, of course, will remain one, notwithstanding the negotiation going on at the moment in Mexico, but also Haiti. I think it's a potential spot to watch. The region has been engulfed in deepening political, economic, and lately humanitarian crisis, spiraling crimes, and also collapsing institutions. So definitely, I think Venezuela and Haiti will be a conflict hotspot going forward. The last thing I wanted to mention is that Latin America is quite interesting. It's actually an interesting way to look at our global relevance, right? Latin America global relevance is not in its geopolitical importance, but it is in the intensity of the conflict, of the violent events, and it's also in the human impact, notably through migration and externalities in terms of stability, global stability, regional stability, but also global stability. Thank you.
Okay, so now we have two more regions to cover very briefly. So next, I'm going to turn to Nigel Gould-Davies, who is our Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia. And so, Nigel, I mean, could you give us your own quick highlights of the developments in your region and broadly what these tell us about the changing politics of the post-Soviet space?
Yes, James. So this past year has seen two major conflict-related developments in what we still call the post-Soviet region, both of which had an international dimension and command international attention. In March and April of this year, we saw Russia carry out the biggest military buildup on Ukraine's eastern border since 2014. That caused a great deal of worrying concern, not only in Ukraine itself, but Europe and the United States. It was, in effect, the first crisis or near crisis of the Biden administration. In the end, those troops, or most of them, withdrew, but plenty of heavy weaponry was still left in the vicinity. Ironically, this had been preceded by a period of relative calm dating from a ceasefire that had been agreed in July of 2020 and largely held until an escalation of attacks, particularly on Ukrainian forces in early 2021 that had eroded this. So this dramatic escalation had been preceded by a period of relative calm, and I think that's important. There's no sense of a resolution of this crisis either. If anything, Russia's policy of passportization of citizens in the Donbass seems to make an ultimate settlement along Minsk agreement lines more remote than ever. The second development was the second war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the autumn of 2020. This led to a decisive Azerbaijani victory and the biggest geopolitical revision of the status quo in the whole post-Soviet region since Russia occupied Crimea in 2014. So again, very significant, again, preceded by a period of relative calm, and again, unresolved. There's a ceasefire in place, but anything but an agreement on the ultimate status of the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, which Azerbaijan has now reoccupied, and much uncertainty. More generally, this shows that 30 years on from the breakup of the Soviet Union, this region, relations among the successor states remain in flux. There is no sense of equilibrium or settlement, either in the case of these two conflicts or more generally. So this is a region to watch in the year to come.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And so finally, with perhaps the most, the largest geographical task, I turn back to Samir Puri to tell us a little about conflicts here where I am and where he is in Asia. So Samir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, James. And rounding off our global tour, Asia is very much in the headlines as a focus of current geopolitical tensions that relate to conflicts yet to come and hopefully that will never come to pass. But of course, with the Armed Conflict Survey, we're looking at the armed conflicts that are still ongoing. And what's astonishing when you look at it, and this is the first of my three takeaways, is how enduring and long-standing some of these armed conflicts are. The most active conflicts in the region, which, as you can see on the map, cover both South and Southeast Asia. Some of these are rooted in the ethnic, religious, irredentist and center province tensions that actually emerged in the newly formed post-colonial states. We have issues around borders such as the 1909 Anglo-Siamese Treaty and the 1854 Durand Line in relation to Afghanistan and Pakistan. This, in addition to the way in which socio-economic inequities have also acted as a root cause and a driver of armed conflicts in Asia, means that, and this is the second takeaway, peace processes have made some progress, but enduring settlements remain elusive. And by that, I mean the prospects for a sustainable peace are still very slim in most of the conflicts that we're looking at in this region. In particular, 2020, we saw some gradual progress in the peace processes in the Philippines, in Thailand, and between India and Pakistan. But there's also been a considerable amount of fragility in relation to that progress. The final and third takeaway from the conflicts in Asia relates to the potential for escalation and spillover. And the two conflicts that really stand out in Asia as posing these threats relate to Afghanistan and Myanmar. And I'm not going to talk in too much detail about these because we're going to have a bit of chance to get into these conflicts in the Q&A. But just very quickly, we all know what's happened in Afghanistan. It's still a lot of uncertainty as what will happen in the future. But even if the Taliban do stabilize to a degree of control, this is a a simmering post-conflict setting if indeed there is no resurgence in violence. And this goes back to what Benjamin said about the long aftermath of conflicts. And Myanmar, the coup that occurred on the 1st of February this year, comes at the very end of the reporting period for this year's armed conflict survey. But I think as if anything, potentially increased the regional significance of conflicts, the many conflicts inside of Myanmar. And so with that, James, I'll hand over back to you for, I think, what's the start of our Q&A.
Very good. Yes, so let's, I've got a few questions which we'll try and get to that have already come in on the Q&A function. But before I do that, as Samir said, we brought along two more of our colleagues just to do well, I won't call it a deep dive because they're going to do it very briskly, but a shallow or quick dive into both Afghanistan and Myanmar, given their two conflicts that have been in the news. So I'll start with Afghanistan. So my colleague Ben Barry, Senior Fellow in our Defense and Military Analysis Program, also an expert on the Afghan conflict. Ben, I mean, partly you have written about the surprising speed of the Taliban's victory, and you may sort of give a précis of that, but I particularly wanted to ask you about the forward-looking prospects for Afghanistan, and in a sense, whether the fact that now the Taliban have emerged victorious may possibly augur less conflict in future in that particular country. But Ben, over to you in the boardroom in London.
James, thank you. The speed of the Taliban's victory had one silver lining, which that there was far less heavy urban fighting than many people might have anticipated. So a considerable reduction in collateral damage and civilian casualties compared with the worst case. Afghanistan faces a crisis and a challenge. The crisis is a fiscal crisis. It was already in it under the previous government, and government salaries had not been paid for several months. With the freezing of much government assets and the non-payment of the aid, the government previously having depended for aid on 80% of its income, there is a crash crisis right now, and the media are clearly reporting the breaking waves of many people rapidly sliding into poverty. This may have a security implication of driving Afghans into the arms of ISIS-KP, with ISIS-KP exploiting dissatisfaction with the Taliban. The security challenge, the main one, is ISIS-KP, which has continued throughout the summer to attack the Taliban, including the recently reported attacks in Jalalabad. The key issue here is, will the Taliban live up to the provisions of the Doha Agreement, that they will prevent international terrorists from basing themselves in Afghanistan and carrying out attacks on the US and its interests? In my view, it's very much in the Taliban's interest to do so, although we must remember that many members of ISKP are reported to have been disillusioned members of the Taliban, so there'll be quite an internal political challenge there.
Thanks, Ben. Finally, my colleague here in Singapore, Aaron Connolly, who runs our Southeast Asia program with the IISS. Aaron, the conflict in Myanmar has, in a sense, been overtaken by Afghanistan at the front of the news. So maybe you might just very briefly catch us up with where things are for those who haven't been following it as closely as you have, but perhaps also drawing on Samir's comments about the internationalization of conflict. Give us a sense of whether, in your view, the Myanmar conflict is best viewed as a plaything of outside forces or fundamentally to do with a kind of indigenous conflict. So Aaron, over to you.
Thanks, James. Well, you know, it's interesting. Myanmar is probably the exception to the rule compared to some of the other conflicts that my colleagues have spoken about. There isn't really a lot of outside intervention in Myanmar. Some of the ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar use Chinese territory as a sort of strategic background. But for the most part, the regional powers, China and India in particular, have restrained themselves from intervening overtly in Myanmar or even supporting those ethnic armed groups in ways that would trigger retaliation by the Myanmar armed forces. And that is actually one of the factors that has led this shadow democratic government, the National Unity Government, as they call themselves, to declare 2 weeks ago today what they call a people's defensive war. And this is really one last push by the democratic forces in Myanmar, which have failed to topple the junta that took power on February 1st through peaceful means to try and topple them through violent means. So far, over the last 2 weeks, we haven't really seen much progress in terms of the NUG's goals. They've been attacking, in particular, telecommunications towers that are owned by the military telecoms company Mytel, which is a joint venture between the Myanmar Armed Forces and the Vietnamese Armed Forces. And they may have toppled around 6 of them, putting 700,000 people out of contact. But there haven't been the kind of upsurge in violence that we would have expected, that would have actually led to a toppling of the junta. And the ethnic armed organizations with whom they sought to ally early on in this struggle, and who do have the weapons and the men and women under arms and the means to be able to topple the Tatmadaw if they so chose, they haven't moved on central Myanmar either. So it looks like we're headed for a situation in which we'll see occasional victories by the democratic forces, particularly in Sagaing region and in Chin State in the west on the border with India. But we're not likely to see either side prevail in terms of extending control over the Burmese parts of Myanmar.
Great, thanks, Aaron. I'm now going to turn to the questions from our audience. We've got a bunch. We'll get through as many as we can as quickly as possible. And since Aaron has the floor, I have a question here from Owen Green here in Singapore. And he asks, how will the ripple effects of the Burmese refugee internally displaced person crisis affect stability elsewhere in Southeast Asia? I suppose a broader take on that question is about Southeast Asian conflict in general, a region that historically has had plenty of conflict, but as Samir's map outlined, presently doesn't have that much. So maybe you could bite off that very quickly, and then we'll move to other colleagues. You're on mute, Aaron.
We've seen a number of particularly police and military defectors seek refuge in India. A number of people seek refuge from the conflict in Chin State and Sagaing region in India. And we've also seen a number of people in northeastern Myanmar seek refuge in China. That's really alarmed the government in Beijing, which worries about them spreading COVID into mainland China. And then we've seen a number of people flee to Thailand. For the most part, the Thai authorities have allowed them to stay in Thailand and not refoul them back to Myanmar. But this is a perennial concern with conflict in Myanmar. Of course, in 2017, we saw nearly 1 million people flee Rakhine State for Bangladesh, and they are still there. And that costs the international community around $1 billion every year just to try and maintain the refugee camps in those areas. And it's something that the rest of Southeast Asia is very concerned about. If those displaced persons were to seek refuge in other parts of Southeast Asia, that could really be politically destabilizing. And it has to some extent in Malaysia over the past year, where it's become a political issue.
Let me take a question from Joshua Mutu, and this gets back to Samir Puri's presentation, so I'll put it to him. One of the big themes of the report, namely the internationalization, in a sense, de-Westernization of conflict. Joshua asks, is there any evidence of a relationship, either positive or negative, between this international involvement in conflicts and the duration and severity of those conflicts? I suppose that's in absolute terms. If outside powers get involved, does it get worse or better? And does this trend for internationalization that you've highlighted, Samir, does that lead us to believe that the picture for conflicts is likely to get worse in future because there's more people meddling in the affairs of other countries? So Samir.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And the short answer is no, there isn't a direct relationship. Because in some instances, countries either fail to secure through their interventions a decisive end, or in the case of the Russian intervention in neighboring Ukraine, the perpetuation of the conflict is indeed the goal. So there's no end that's actually in sight. It's there to diminish and compromise Ukrainian sovereignty. But just to go back to that first point about failure to secure a decisive end, I mean, clearly the Saudi intervention in Yemen that Emile pointed to is one that's really run aground and left the Saudis in a position of wanting to get out of it. But just very finally, in terms of the outlook, obviously no one can predict the future, but Aaron's point is quite an important one, that when Myanmar became further destabilized, neither China nor India intervened. And neither China nor India have actually got a sort of very long pedigree of extensive interventions in other people's conflicts. India did intervene disastrously in Sri Lanka a few decades ago, but we watch and we wait, and this is something we're studying, of course, at the IISS, is the changing nature of interventions going ahead, especially in a sort of less unipolar world.
I've got a question here from Pratibha Thakur, and I think I'll ask Emile Hokayem to pick this one up. We haven't heard a huge amount about the United States as still the world's dominant geopolitical actor, but Pratibha asks, the US is reshaping its engagement in the Middle East and Central Asia, but let's focus on the Middle East with a greater focus on diplomacy and a lighter military presence. And he asks, do you think this will create a potentially dangerous extra space for other major powers, particularly Russia and China, maybe India, to move into the Middle East, already complicating the picture that you outlined with Russia and Turkey? So Emile Hokayem.
In the short term, it seems like, at least under the Biden administration, the US eagerness to extricate itself from the region is leading a number of parties to talk to each other. So there is actually a regional de-escalation, not yet at the détente, that's ongoing. And actually the levels of violence now are, generally lower than what they were a few years back. But, if you take another step back, yes, I mean, the US decision, for instance, in 2013 not to intervene in Syria, in a way allowed Russia to operate in that space with much more freedom of operation. Similarly, a number of regional countries have pursued their own security interests directly, knowing that the US wouldn't necessarily intervene, restrain them, etc. So, the South.
So we've gone on mute. Sorry. Let's try that one more time. We're still on mute. Apologies. Go ahead.
Saudi and Yemen, for instance, or a number of countries in Libya. The US took a step back after its intervention in 2011, like other NATO powers, and there was a strategic vacuum that was filled by a number of countries, including most recently by India. So yes, there's certainly an expectation that countries like Russia, but not only Russia, will increase their military profile in the region through intervention, but also through defense sales, basing and deployment of technologies such as UAVs.
Thanks, Emile. Normally we allow one question per person, but Joshua had two, and they're both rather good, so I'm going to give him a second bite at the cherry. So Joshua Mutu, and I'll ask Benjamin Petrini this question. So Benjamin, the reason I'm asking is you had mentioned the long tail of conflicts becoming more protracted in your initial remarks. And so Joshua asked, what opportunities or solutions are there for resolving frozen conflicts around the world? Is diplomacy the answer, or ultimately, as is the case in many civil wars, does one side have to win? How would you attack this question of frozen conflicts?
It's an excellent question. Thank you, James. Well, let's define frozen conflicts are those conflicts that have been protracted for several years or several decades, and those that at times have sparks of violence, but that usually have very simmering and low levels of violence. So to tackle those conflicts decisively, I think that a multilateral coalition in diplomatic terms that has the legitimacy is ultimately the answer. Now, that's very well said and easily said than done, as, for example, the conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh or others in the Europe and Central Asia region have shown, like the one in Cyprus, have shown to be very, very difficult to tackle. I think that coming with very tangible economic incentives for the post-war and for really addressing what is that, as I was describing, what is that long-term plan, idea, and strategy for the post-conflict reconstruction. We have seen, the evidence shows us that we have seen frozen conflicts, as you were hinting, both resolved militarily and diplomatically, but mostly they've been protracted. Back to you, James. Thank you.
Very good. I'll direct this next question to Nigel Gould-Davies. It's from Yogendra Kumar. The sharper-eyed amongst you may have seen on one of the maps in the presentation that the Russian conflicts and Russian interventions were also often bracketed by something called the Wagner Group, which is a mysterious paramilitary organization that non-Russian specialists might not know much about. Anyway, Nigel, Yogendra asks, are the operation of Russian contract soldiers deployed in different regions economically viable? And for those who don't know much about the mysterious world of Russian contract weapons, maybe you might say a little bit about that as well.
Yes, thank you. It's a good question. I think the first point is that the term that's widely used, private military contractor, is in a sense misleading. Wagner Group and others like it operating from Russia are in no sense genuinely private, and their status is quite different from those of Western counterparts. Technically speaking, under Russian law, such organizations are in fact illegal. And Wagner Group operates only because it has very close links to the Russian state and specifically to Russian military intelligence, and could not contemplate doing anything significant without the Russian state's approval. Which is not to say they don't sometimes run into tensions with the Ministry of Defense. On the matter of economic viability, it's a low-cost instrument. And not only is it low cost, it can sometimes be profitable as well. Wagner Group is involved in various economic operations in some parts of the world. Its involvement in some African conflicts, Central Africa in particular, is linked to mining activity. So this is might describe as an implausibly deniable instrument of the Russian state that advances Russian security, but also commercial interests.
Right, we're very close to our allotted hour, but I'm going to squeeze in one more very quick question, and I'll direct this to Ben Barry. It's about Afghanistan. This is from Tedu Gentar Alam, and they ask, the success of the Taliban in taking over Afghanistan has sparked a wave of Islamist euphoria across the region. What does the Taliban's comeback mean for Islamic movements elsewhere? Specifically, does that augur further conflict in that region? So Ben, over to you, and then I'll hand over to Irene just to say thank you and goodbye. So Ben Barry.
In a phrase, the apparent defeat of the US and its ally in the Afghan government and their forces will be seen by Islamic extremists and jihadists worldwide as extremely encouraging. It will also be seen by countries that are worried about violent extremism as discouraging. For example, I'd expect in New Delhi, the Indian authorities would be greatly concerned about anti-Indian groups gaining a hand in ungoverned space in Afghanistan. There isn't any good news about this, I'm afraid.
Very good, admirably brief. Thank you very much to all of my panelists and to all of those of you for the questions. Just before we wrap up this evening, let me hand over to Dr. Irene to say a final word about the Armed Conflict Survey and what's coming next from us. Irene, over to you.
Thanks, James. Just wanted to thank you, especially you, James, for this masterful moderation and for keeping the time, and also to my wonderful colleague who actually helped with the report, with the team who is here in the room with us. I think the report is out, so I really hope it's going to help with the strategic analysis to really further understanding of conflict. And as our video said, really understanding conflict is the base for trying to solve them. So with this, thanks so much for everybody for tuning in, and hope the report will be useful for all of you. Thanks so much.